I wasn't supposed to be there forever. That was always the plan. 5 years, maybe 6, working behind the scenes under a different last name, learning the ins and outs of the company my father built from the ground up. He used to say, a company is only as good as the people who quietly hold it together when no one's watching. I took that literally. After he passed away, I asked the board to bring in someone new to lead while I stepped back. Publicly, I was too grief-stricken to take the reins. Privately, I was devastated, but also determined not to live in his shadow. So I requested to be transferred from corporate strategy to a mid-level position in operations under my mother's maiden name, Jessica Hale. I wanted to earn everything. I didn't want to be the girl in the boardroom people whispered about, who never lifted a finger but still signed the checks. First, no one noticed me, and that was the point. I showed up, I did my job, I stayed late, and I asked questions. Sometimes too many. I watched new leadership shuffle through, each trying to rebrand our legacy, most failing. But I kept my head down. I wasn't interested in politics, only in protecting what my father built. Quietly, from within. And for the most part, it worked. Then Rachel Carter showed up. I knew who she was the moment she walked into the town hall meeting, wearing that power red blazer, flanked by 2 consultants from some overpriced branding agency. She introduced herself as a culture-first CEO with a vision for transformation and a zero-tolerance policy for dead weight. I sat in the 4th row, arms crossed, watching the eyes of my colleagues narrow as her rehearsed speech dragged on. We all knew what that meant. I'd seen it before. Culture first meant loyalty first. Transformation meant layoffs. Zero tolerance meant fear. Rachel was the kind of woman who performed leadership. She listened when people watched. She smiled for cameras. She said things like reimagine agility and disrupt legacy mindsets as if we weren't already doing the hard work without her. Within her first week, she had an assistant rearranging the executive suite and a new core values poster hanging in every hallway. They were things like velocity, candor, and ownership. The irony wasn't lost on me. The people who embodied those values were already being pushed to the margins. By month 2, entire teams were gone. Legacy employees, those who had helped my father keep this place running through the lean years, were let go under the guise of strategic redundancy. Rachel called it streamlining. I called it what it was: erasure. She never looked twice at those of us who didn't wear suits or speak in jargon. She assumed anyone not sitting at the executive table was either replaceable or irrelevant. She never asked questions. She never asked who built the forecasting system she praised in her 3rd week. She never looked twice at the ops analyst who quietly fixed the supply chain mess that almost cost us our biggest manufacturing contract. Nor yet that ops analyst was me. She didn't know who I was, and I never corrected her. I let her interrupt me in meetings. I let her call me too cautious when I questioned a $300,000 0-cents contract with an efficiency consultant that had no measurable ROI. I let her take my slide deck and present it as her own to the board. I let her sideline me from the digital transition project I'd spent 9 months developing. I let her think I was no threat at all. And then one afternoon, I walked into a meeting that wasn't on my calendar. Rachel was already seated at the table with HR. The room had that stiff, overly polite tension that always precedes a punch to the gut. She didn't waste time. She said the company was moving in a new direction, and unfortunately, my style and approach no longer aligned with the cultural evolution she was driving. She used phrases like difficult conversations and realignment of values. HR sat silently, eyes flicking back and forth between us like they were watching a scripted play. I asked one question: is this performance-based? She hesitated, then said it wasn't about performance, it was about fit. Fit. After 5 years of silence, I almost laughed. I nodded, stood, and thanked her for the clarity. She looked relieved. She thought I was broken. She had no idea what she'd just done. My name's Jessica Monroe. My father was Richard Monroe, founder and majority shareholder of this company, and Rachel Carter just fired the largest voting member of her own board of directors. The thing about getting fired is, it doesn't really hit you until the next morning. Not when you're calmly walking out of the HR conference room with your severance packet, or when your badge is deactivated 30 minutes later, or even when the IT team unceremoniously wipes your work laptop before you have a chance to forward a single file. It hits you the next day, when your calendar is empty, your inbox is silent, and the company you helped build is moving on like you were never there. Except I wasn't just anyone, and I wasn't going anywhere. I spent the first 24 hours in silence. I didn't call the board, I didn't text the one friend still left in executive strategy. I didn't even open the envelope HR had given me. I sat on my balcony with a legal pad writing out everything I knew. Every timeline, every project, every person Rachel had strategically cut or forced out. I didn't need to build a case for revenge. This wasn't about vengeance. This was about responsibility. My father didn't leave me 47% of a multi-million-dollar company so I could watch it crumble under some opportunistic leadership coach in heels. Rachel thought she'd executed a clean surgical removal. What she didn't know was that her severance packet didn't touch my ownership stake. My legal name, Jessica Monroe, was nowhere near the employee records. My shares were managed through a trust that required multiple layers of verification and anonymity. That wasn't an accident. My father was paranoid about legacy, about what would happen if a CEO ever tried to hijack the culture he'd built with blood and bone. He used to say, always make sure the loudest person in the room doesn't realize who controls the microphone. He was right. Next few days, I gathered quietly. I spoke to Alan, our corporate attorney, and one of the few people who knew the truth about my identity. He wasn't surprised to hear from me. I figured I'd be hearing from you sooner or later, he said over the phone. Word around the executive suite is Rachel thinks she's got a mandate. She's consolidating fast. I asked him about the board. Were they aware of the layout of the unapproved consultant spend? Alan sighed. Not officially. Rachel's positioned it all as part of a reorganization plan. She's calling it necessary restructuring. No one's pushed back because, on paper, the margins are improving. Margins. That word made my stomach twist. My father didn't run this company for margins. He ran it for stability, for people, for longevity. He always said anyone can spike numbers for a quarter. The question is whether your company still exists 3 years later. I knew Rachel was juicing the books, cutting experienced staff, replacing them with younger, cheaper labor, slashing budgets on long-term projects that didn't show immediate ROI. It looked good now, but it would be a disaster within 12 months. And the board, most of them had never walked the factory floor. They didn't know the difference between short-term efficiency and long-term collapse. But I did, and I had every intention of showing them. Meanwhile, Rachel was busy painting the company red and white, literally. She'd rebranded everything. New logo, new mission statement, new office furniture with standing desks and fake plants in every corner. It was the kind of superficial redecoration that masked internal rot. I saw it in the memos that leaked online, in the LinkedIn posts from former employees talking about toxic positivity and leadership that doesn't listen. She even started a podcast, Leading with Vision, she called it. I listened to 2 episodes. They were 10-minute word salads laced with hollow buzzwords and self-congratulatory anecdotes. I made notes. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. An internal source sent me a draft of Rachel's next big initiative, an organizational cleanup memo that would recommend phasing out the research and development wing. Yes, the very department that had developed our most successful supply chain models, IP, and operational systems. I laughed out loud. This wasn't leadership. This was corporate cannibalism. And still, I said nothing. That weekend, I drove out to my father's old house, which I now owned but rarely visited. The place still smelled faintly of cedar and the cologne he used to wear. In his study, I unlocked the cabinet where he used to keep emergency files. Inside was a copy of the company charter, notes from past board meetings, and a handwritten document labeled Contingency, Hostile Leadership. I read every page. My father had thought of everything. The document outlined a protocol to call for an emergency board vote if the company's direction deviated from core values. It included trigger points, excessive restructuring, employee turnover beyond a certain percentage, sudden budget reallocations. Rachel had hit all 3. I spent the night outlining a strategy. I wasn't going to show up angry and demanding. I was going to walk into that boardroom with data, with proof, and with authority. But first, I needed one more thing: undeniable evidence of misconduct. It couldn't just be a disagreement over management style. I needed financial irregularities, policy violations, something that would not only open the board's eyes but force their hands. So I started digging. I knew from my years in operations where to look: vendor logs, consultant invoices, contractor contracts. I had old access credentials that still worked in certain archived systems. I found a $150,000 0 cents payment to a consulting firm with no active website, no LinkedIn presence, and a mailing address linked to a co-working space in Ohio. Another invoice showed a marketing retainer paid out to a strategic brand consultant with a name suspiciously similar to one of Rachel's close college friends. It didn't take long to connect the dots. I printed everything, annotated it, and put it in a folder. My hand hovered over the final document, the one Rachel had signed the day I was fired. Her signature, right there above the clause she never read. The clause that stated no change in employment would affect the shareholders' voting rights. I smiled. Rachel had been trying to build her empire in a house I already owned. And now, it was time to knock on the front door. The first time I saw the boardroom after my father's death, I was 29, seated in the far corner like an observer in my own story. I remember gripping the arms of the chair too tightly, trying to slow my heartbeat while the men at the table spoke in acronyms and phrases like monetize the brand equity and short-term pain, long-term gain. None of them mentioned loyalty. None mentioned the faces in the distribution center who came in at 5 a.m. to keep this place running, or the head of legal who'd skipped his anniversary to finish the sale that saved our fourth quarter that year. That was when I learned that titles didn't mean wisdom, and seats at the table didn't always belong to the right people. So when I stepped back into that room 5 years later, I didn't shake. I didn't grip the arms of any chair. I walked straight through the glass doors with a portfolio under my arm, nodded at the receptionist, and said 6 simple words: "I'm here for the shareholders review." She didn't question me. She didn't ask for my name. Because I wasn't walking in as Jessica Hale, junior analyst. I was returning as Jessica Monroe, the majority shareholder, and someone with a voice that could no longer be ignored. The meeting hadn't started yet, which was intentional. I wanted to get there before Rachel. I wanted the board to see me, hear me, and remember what this company was built on before she could drown them in another glossy deck full of slogans and smiles. Alan was already there, sitting to the right of the long table, flipping through his notes with that same calm, unreadable face he always wore in crisis. He stood when he saw me. "They don't know you're coming," he said quietly. "Good," I replied. "Then they'll actually listen." I took the seat my father used to occupy, near the head, but not quite at it. He always said you didn't need to sit at the head to lead, you just needed to know where the decisions were made. One by one, the board members arrived. Most of them looked surprised to see me, a few confused, but no one questioned it. No one dared. That was the benefit of owning more stock than any of them. You didn't need to be invited. You were the reason the meeting existed in the first place. When Rachel finally entered, she was all smiles and shine, trailing her assistant like a shadow and holding a tablet that probably contained another 100-slide presentation on culture evolution. She stopped mid-stride when she saw me. Her smile faltered just slightly, not enough for the untrained eye to notice, but I saw it. The crack, the hesitation, the confusion. She recovered quickly and said, "Jessica, I didn't expect you here today." I smiled without showing my teeth. "Clearly." The board chair, a man named Stephen Ward, who'd been on for nearly 15 years, cleared his throat. "I believe we're all here now. Let's begin." Rachel launched into her presentation like nothing was amiss, but I watched her eyes flick to me every time she clicked to a new slide. I didn't interrupt. Not yet. I let her talk about progress, about streamlining, about the future. She spoke about cost savings and brand alignment, about recruiting influencers to make our products more digitally relevant. She mentioned the layoffs once, carefully framed as difficult but necessary optimization. She never mentioned the people. She never used their names. When she finished, there was a smattering of nods around the room. Rachel looked pleased, as if the vote to approve her next phase was already in the bag. She turned to the chair and said, "I move we advance phase 2 of the reorg effective immediately." Then she made the mistake of looking at me. "Unless there are any objections?" I reached into my portfolio and pulled out a thin, organized binder. Actually, I said, finally speaking, I do have some concerns. I've compiled a few documents I think the board might want to review before taking a vote. I stood and handed out printed copies to each member, watching as their expressions shifted from curiosity to confusion to concern. Rachel didn't move. Her assistant reached out, but I held the final copy until Rachel met my eye. Then I handed it to her, slowly. You might want to pay close attention to page 6, I said. It details a consulting firm paid $150,000, 0 cents, for strategic brand positioning, a firm with no verifiable employees, and no active clients outside this company. Silence fell over the room like a curtain. Stephen opened the binder and flipped to the page. So did the others. Rachel didn't move. She stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time. And maybe she was. Maybe, finally, she realized the girl she'd fired 2 weeks ago wasn't just some relic of the old regime. She was the regime. She was the bloodline. I continued. Page 9 outlines another retainer, $82,000, 0 cents, paid to a marketing consultant with a shared address to a property registered under the name of Rachel Carter's college roommate. I also included screenshots from internal documents that suggest unapproved budget shifts from R&D to contractor expenses, with no performance oversight or deliverables. Stephen looked up. These are serious accusations? I nodded. They're also fully documented and cross-referenced with internal audit protocols that were bypassed in each case. Rachel finally spoke. This is a misunderstanding. All contracts were approved by procurement. I cut her off, my voice firm but calm. Procurement was directed to fast-track all vendor approvals under your executive authority. You waived the vetting process 6 times in 90 days. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Then I dropped the final note, and finally I said, for the record, I would like it noted that, as of this morning, I have executed my voting rights as majority shareholder to request an emergency vote of confidence in the CEO. Per Section 3.1 of the Monroe Contingency Clause, a leadership challenge may be triggered if material evidence of ethical misconduct is presented to the board. I believe that condition has now been met. Rachel's assistant looked panicked. Rachel looked stunned. And the board? They looked ready to listen. Not to a buzzword presentation, not to a rebranding pitch, but to someone who hadn't just read the charter, but whose family had written it. Someone who remembered what this company used to stand for, and who had come back to make sure it never forgot again. When I left that boardroom, I didn't feel victorious. Not yet. I felt like I'd finally placed my first stone on the chessboard. The silence after my last sentence had been suffocating. No outbursts, no immediate vote, just the sound of pages turning and pens scratching. As the board members combed through the documents I'd delivered, Rachel had said nothing more. But her posture told me everything. Gone was the confident executive with perfect posture and rehearsed poise. In her place sat a woman blinking too often, gripping her stylus so tightly it looked like it might snap in half. She hadn't expected a fight, let alone one from the very person she'd carelessly cast aside. But this wasn't just about her poor judgment anymore. It was about what she did while drunk on the illusion of invincibility. 2 hours after the meeting, Alan called. The board had voted to initiate a formal internal review. Rachel hadn't been removed yet, but her executive authority was frozen pending an audit. They're rattled, he said. Your evidence hit harder than I think even you expected. I didn't respond at first. I was staring at the wall in my living room, my father's old brass clock ticking faintly in the background. It lingers. I should be rattled, I finally said. This wasn't a misstep. This was a deliberate power grab fueled by ego and wrapped in jargon, and it almost worked. But I knew Rachel wouldn't go down easily. Narcissists rarely do. I didn't expect her to sulk in a corner or resign gracefully. No, she would fight back with charm, manipulation, and half-truths. She'd try to reframe my actions as reactive, personal, driven by legacy wounds. She'd work the political angles, exploit board members who preferred stability over scandal. She'd build her counter-narrative, which meant I had to stay 2 steps ahead. By Monday morning, Rachel had sent out a company-wide email titled Transparency and the Road Ahead. It was full of vague affirmations and deliberately neutral language. As part of our commitment to excellence and fiduciary responsibility, we welcome the board's due diligence. The rest read like it was penned by a PR crisis manager on autopilot. She never mentioned the audit directly, nor did she acknowledge that her leadership was now under review. I watched as employees commented heart emojis and words like "proud to work here" under the post she shared on LinkedIn. The illusion of control is a powerful thing. I met with Alan that afternoon to discuss the next steps. "We need to prepare for escalation," he said. "She might go on the offensive. Legal threats, public statements, even selective leaks." I nodded. "Let her try, I've got more." And I did. The documents I'd presented were only part of the file I'd compiled. There were emails I hadn't yet printed, internal threads where she greenlit consulting spend with no approval chain, where she dismissed employee concerns as legacy whining, where she mocked one department head's mental health leave as strategic burnout. And then there were the exit interview logs. I'd pulled 36 from the HR system, each one detailing patterns of retaliation, inconsistent terminations, and a toxic leadership style that, when laid out in sequence, painted a very different picture than the one Rachel liked to present during quarterly earnings calls. I wasn't just building a case anymore, I was documenting a pattern of calculated, corrosive decision-making masked as corporate transformation. I wanted the board to see what happened when unchecked ambition replaced steady leadership, when performative innovation took precedence over substance, when image overtook integrity. And the more I assembled, the more I realized something deeper. Rachel wasn't just trying to lead. She was trying to erase everything this company used to be, as if starting from scratch would make her legacy more legitimate. And I couldn't allow that. The next few days moved like a quiet storm. The board appointed an independent investigator, an executive compliance officer with a reputation for cutting through spin. Rachel was told to provide documentation for all discretionary spending in the past 6 months. Her calendar was subpoenaed. Her assistant, from what I heard, was taking a leave of absence. Rumors trickled through the company like electricity. Some employees sensed the shift in air. Others had no idea anything had changed at all. That was the danger of modern leadership. It all looked polished on the surface, even while it rotted from within. Then, late Thursday evening, I got a text from one of my former colleagues in finance. Just 3 words: "She's playing dirty." Attached was a screenshot, an internal memo drafted by Rachel to be circulated the next morning. It was a thinly veiled hit job. It implied that disgruntled former staff with historical personal connections to the company were attempting to obstruct necessary modernization. She didn't name me, but she didn't need to. Anyone with half a brain would know who she was talking about. I read the draft twice, then I smiled. She had made her first mistake. By framing my actions as emotional retaliation, she'd opened the door for me to respond, publicly. And I had something she didn't: truth, evidence, and a name that still carried weight in places her rebranding hadn't touched. The next morning, before the memo went out, I requested a meeting with Stephen and 2 other senior board members. I brought with me a sealed envelope and a single-page statement. "If she pushes this through, I'm prepared to release this to our largest institutional investors," I told them. "It includes verified documentation of her conflict of interest, direct violations of internal policy, and a comparative retention report that shows turnover has increased by 62% since she took over." Stephen exhaled through his nose. "Are you threatening us?" I shook my head. "I'm informing you, if you don't act now, the shareholders will." 3 hours later, the internal memo never appeared. Rachel's LinkedIn went quiet. The podcast went on indefinite hiatus, and the board called an emergency executive session for Monday. The walls were closing in. And this time they weren't mine. The emergency board session was scheduled for 9:00 a.m. on Monday, but I was at the office by 7:30. Not because I needed the time to prepare, my work was already done, but because I wanted to be the first person they saw when they walked in. Let them remember that I wasn't just a whisper in the background anymore. I was here, present, unmoving. The founder's daughter sitting at the heart of her father's legacy, ready to do what he no longer could. Alan met me in the lobby with 2 coffees and a copy of the final internal report from the independent investigator. He handed it to me without a word, but I saw the shift in his expression, a tightening around the eyes, a flicker of vindication. We both knew what this document meant. Rachel Carter had crossed every line and signed her name on the way down. We rode the elevator in silence, the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the slow drag of the seconds between floors stretching into something weightier than time. When the doors opened, I stepped out first. The boardroom lights were already on, the long table gleamed. At the far end, Stephen Ward was reviewing notes with 2 other members, both of whom looked up as I entered. No polite nods this time, just acknowledgement. Unspoken and clear. Rachel walked in at 8:55, her heels sharper than usual, her hair pulled back so tight it made her features look almost angular. She was dressed in navy instead of her usual reds and creams, and for the first time, she wasn't smiling. She saw the envelope in front of each board member's seat and paused just slightly. Barely a blink, but I caught it. That was the moment she knew the narrative had slipped out of her control. Stephen opened the meeting with stiff formality. We're convening today to address the findings of the internal audit and determine the appropriate course of action moving forward. He didn't waste time. Jessica, as the initiator of the shareholder clause, you have the floor. I stood slowly, letting the weight of silence settle before I spoke. Thank you, Mr. Ward. Before we begin, I'd like to read a short statement from my father's personal notes, written the year before his passing. It was part of the original values charter for the company, one that never made it to the glossy posters but lived in the leadership binder he carried for 32 years. I unfolded a worn piece of paper and read aloud. Companies don't die because of competition. They die when they forget who they are. When numbers become more important than names. When vision is replaced with vanity. I set the paper down. I believe this company has come dangerously close to forgetting who it is. Then I let the documents do the talking. Pages highlighted in yellow and underlined in red. Vendor payments to entities that didn't exist 6 months prior. Contracts awarded without competitive bidding. Friends of Rachel listed as consultants for work they never delivered. Severance packages issued selectively to employees who'd raised concerns about culture. Direct messages recovered from archived servers in which she referred to long-standing team members as low-value assets. A chart comparing retention, productivity, and morale between the year before she arrived and the present quarter. It wasn't a dip, it was a landslide. Rachel sat stone-faced through most of it, only interrupting once to say the findings were incomplete and lacked context, but her voice trembled on the second syllable. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The board was reading everything for themselves and the room had shifted. The doubt was gone. This was no longer about clashing visions. It was about ethics, about trust. Stephen cleared his throat. Based on these findings, and in accordance with the stipulations outlined in Section 3.1 of the Monroe Contingency Clause, I propose a motion to remove Rachel Carter from the position of Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately, pending a final shareholder vote. No one spoke for a moment. Then came the first nod, then another. Then the votes, raised hands counted one by one. The majority was clear, unanimous. Rachel didn't speak as the vote concluded. Her hands were clenched in her lap, knuckles white. Her eyes didn't meet mine. She just stared straight ahead as Stepan announced the result and directed her to meet with legal and HR for exit protocols. It was over, just like that, clean, professional, brutal. And then she stood. I hope you're proud of yourself, she said quietly, her voice flat. You just dragged this company backwards to make a point. I didn't flinch. No, I reminded it who it is. She walked out, the silence stretching long behind her. The room didn't celebrate. There were no congratulations, no applause, just the collective realization that a storm had passed, and the cleanup had only just begun. Stephen turned to me. Jessica, the board would like to formally request your guidance during the transition period, at least until we appoint an interim. I nodded. Of course. When I left the room, Alan followed me down the hall. It's done, he said. I shook my head. Not yet. There's still a company to rebuild. He smiled slightly. Just like your father. But I wasn't him. I wasn't rebuilding it for legacy or pride. I was doing it for the people who never had a voice in that room to begin with. For the names Rachel had crossed off a list without thought. For the employees who'd given years of their lives to something they believed in. For the company that almost forgot what it stood for. The company that was mine now. The day after Rachel's removal felt eerily still. The kind of silence that settles over a company when leadership falls. Not chaotic, not celebratory, just waiting. Most employees didn't know yet. There'd been no public announcement, no internal memo, just the quiet disappearance of her name from the organizational chart and the absence of her presence from meetings she once dominated. I knew that wouldn't last. The questions would come fast and loud, and I needed to be the one with the answers before someone else rewrote the story. I didn't sit in Rachel's office. That space was still too sharp, too performative, full of empty platitudes etched on glass and whiteboards filled with buzzwords that meant nothing. Instead, I took over a corner conference room down the hall and told Alan to have it listed as Strategic Transition HQ on the internal calendar. That was enough to start the murmurs, and soon enough, they came, first in pairs, then in groups of 3 or 4, department heads, senior analysts, even executive assistants who'd been looped out of the inner circle for too long. Some came with cautious optimism. Some came with guarded skepticism. But all came with the same quiet hope in their eyes. That maybe, just maybe, this company could become something better again. I spent 2 full days listening. No titles, no power plays, just legal pads full of names, departments, timelines, and stories. People opened up in ways I hadn't anticipated. They talked about what it had been like to work under Rachel's leadership, the fear, the isolation, the gaslighting. They told me about talented employees who were pushed out because they weren't loud enough or shiny enough, or because they asked too many questions. They shared stories about product decisions that were made without consulting the people who actually built the systems, about diversity initiatives that existed only in press releases, about ethics training that meant nothing when the violations came from the top. I wasn't surprised, but I was angry. Angrier than I'd expected. Because as I sat in that room, hearing one account after another, I realized just how close we'd come to losing everything my father had tried to protect. Rachel hadn't just shifted the company's strategy, she'd poisoned its core. And she'd done it with a smile, under the guise of progress. By the end of the week, I'd compiled a working list of the most urgent issues: rebuild trust internally, audit every contract signed in the past 12 months, reinstate the ethics committee Rachel had quietly disbanded, and review all terminations issued during her tenure. That last one was personal. Too many good people had been discarded for the sake of metrics that meant nothing in the long run. If we were going to heal, we needed to start with accountability. Meanwhile, word had started to spread beyond the walls. Industry insiders caught wind of the leadership shakeup. Shareholders began reaching out with questions. The press wasn't far behind. I received an email from a journalist at a major business magazine who'd been tracking Rachel's rise and now her sudden fall. He wanted a comment. I wasn't ready to speak publicly yet, not until the board signed off on a formal transition plan. But I knew the story would leak soon, and I wasn't about to let the narrative slip out of our hands again. So I met with Stephen and the remaining board members and proposed a bold move. We make the announcement ourselves, I said. Full transparency. We don't spin it. We tell the truth. We say we're course correcting, that we listened, that the company belongs to its people again. There was hesitation, of course. Corporate instinct is always to contain, to package, to minimize damage. But damage control wasn't what we needed. We needed restoration, a reset that didn't pretend nothing had happened, but acknowledged it, owned it, and committed to doing better. To my surprise, they agreed. I drafted the letter myself. It began like this. To our employees, partners, and stakeholders, this company was built on trust, and we recognize that trust has been strained. We're not here to deflect or diffuse. We're here to rebuild. Together, we released the statement internally and externally at 9:00 IAM on a Tuesday. By noon, my inbox was flooded. Not just with media requests, but with emails from former employees, clients, and even competitors. Some were congratulatory, some were cautiously supportive. One came from a former intern who'd left 3 months ago after being told by Rachel that he wasn't cut out for corporate culture. He wrote, "If this is what culture looks like now, maybe there's hope." And then came the call I hadn't expected. Information, it was from Rachel. The number came through as unknown, but I knew the moment I answered. Her voice was flat, clipped, devoid of the performance she used to wear like perfume. "Congratulations," she said. "You won." I didn't respond right away. I wasn't interested in victory dances or closure calls. But I let the silence linger, just long enough to make it clear that I wasn't about to fill it for her. She continued, "Just so you know, I was offered a consultant role at Langford. They don't care about your little crusade, they care about results, something you may want to think about when the buzz dies down." There it was, the last flicker of her ego, the dying ember of someone who still believed the only thing that mattered was winning. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "I'm not building this company for buzz," I said finally. "I'm building it so that the people who work here don't flinch every time someone says the word culture." She didn't reply, the line went dead. I sat with that for a while. Not because I needed the validation, but because it reminded me of something my father once said during one of our late-night strategy talks. "A good leader knows when to make noise. A great one knows when to let silence speak louder." The silence now wasn't empty. It was full of possibility. I returned to the office the next morning and walked through every floor. No entourage, no formal meetings, just conversations. I shook hands with the junior developers. I stopped by the distribution team's break room and asked them what needed fixing. I walked into the cafeteria and sat with a group of employees I'd never met. One of them, a woman in her 50s who'd been with us for over 20 years, said, "It feels different already, like someone's watching who actually sees us." I did see them. I always had. And now, for the first time, they saw me too. Not as a symbol, not as the founder's daughter, but as the person who'd fought to give them their company back. 3 months later, the company looked different, not because of a rebrand or a marketing campaign, but because the people inside it stood straighter. Meetings were shorter but more honest. Emails were less performative, more purposeful. There was laughter in the elevators again, and for the first time in years, people stayed late not because they were afraid, but because they wanted to finish something that mattered. It wasn't perfect. Rebuilding never is, but something fundamental had shifted. Something that no memo or initiative could fake. People believed in the work again. I hadn't accepted the CEO title. I could have. The board offered it after the transition committee concluded its work, but I declined. It wasn't about modesty or strategy, it was about clarity. I didn't want to be the figurehead. I wanted to be the foundation. I appointed an interim CEO from inside the company, someone who had quietly kept operations afloat while others took credit. She didn't have a flashy resume or a podcast, but she had the respect of every department she'd ever worked with. When we announced her promotion, the applause was real, sustained, and more than anything, earned. I focused on structural reform. I led the reinstatement of our internal ethics board, this time with rotating seats for non-executive employees. I helped establish a budget for anonymous innovation pitches so anyone from any department could submit ideas without worrying about politics. I reviewed every single separation agreement issued under Rachel's tenure and personally reached out to a dozen former employees with invitations to return. Not all said yes. Some were still too hurt, too skeptical. I respected that. But some did come back, and those who did walked through the doors with quiet pride, like something they loved had been rescued. One morning, I arrived early, as I always did. The building was quiet, that gentle hum of machines warming up and coffee brewing in distant kitchens. I walked the halls, not as a leader or even a shareholder, but as someone revisiting every corner of something she had almost lost. On the wall just outside the conference center, there was a display that had been recently updated. It used to hold the original company values: efficiency, innovation, market reach. Now I read something else. The words were painted in clean, bold type: respect, accountability, people. I stopped and stared at it for a long moment. It hadn't been my idea. I hadn't even signed off on it. But I didn't need to. They got it. They understood. That was the real victory. Not that Rachel had been removed or that I had proven anything to the board, but that the people inside the company were now protecting it with the same vigilance my father once had. That evening, I found myself in my father's old office again, the one I had avoided for so long. I stood by the window where he used to pace during long calls and looked out over the city skyline just beginning to soften under sunset. I remembered the way he used to speak about legacy, not as a monument to be admired, but as a duty to be carried forward. He never wanted worship. He wanted continuity. Honor the past, he used to say, but don't let it chain you. Use it as a compass, not a cage. On the corner of his desk was the old leather-bound notebook where he had kept handwritten notes from every major decision. I hadn't opened it in years, but now, with the dust of war settled, I reached for it. Inside was a note I hadn't remembered seeing before. Just one sentence, underlined in his unmistakable scrawl. When you inherit something precious, fight for it like you built it yourself. I closed the book, set it gently back on the desk, and turned out the lights. This company didn't need a savior. It needed someone who remembered what it was and who refused to let anyone forget it again.